Welcome to Carbon Conversations, a podcast by Biochar Life, where we explore the cutting edge of environmental solutions. From biochar to smart agriculture to the climate tech revolution, we sit down with experts and business leaders at the forefront of change. This is your host, Matt Rickard. Hey, Paul. Good evening or end of day. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good, Matt. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thanks. Been looking forward to this. I don't think we've met. We certainly have been in the same kind of circles for many years, and you for a lot longer than me. I've been in this space probably for 4 or 5 years, but yourself going back to, I would say, one of the kind of first movers, even with Nori. And maybe as a quick introduction, many people know Nori. Many people who listen to the podcast will know you, but still good to do a bit of an intro. And I know you've kind of shifted gears a little, doing some other stuff. I've been reading your blog and really enjoying some of that, which we'll get into some of the topics. But maybe as a bit of a kickoff, maybe a short introduction would be great.
Sure, yeah. So my background educationally was in computer engineering, and I worked in software agency land for a bunch of years post college. And then in 2015, I got really interested in carbon removal because I was looking at it from the perspective of, I'm really interested in working on climate change and how do we make this whole problem go away? And it seemed from like an engineering perspective, like, why don't we just pull the carbon back out of the air? And I started researching and looking around and wasn't finding really anyone or anything, any resource that was discussing that in 2015. And that's because back then it was seen as a moral hazard. Like if we develop the ways of pulling and extracting CO2 out of the air, then we're going to take all of the responsibility away from the large emitters to decarbonize, and we don't want to do that. So people just didn't really talk about it. But back then I was trying to make the argument, well, it's too late. It doesn't matter. There's already way too much carbon in the air. We have to pull it out no matter what. So we better get started. And if we're going to do that, then we need to go through kind of an enormous industry creation process. And you don't just pull large amounts of carbon out of the air just by snapping your fingers. Like you have to put an enormous amount of capital and business building and infrastructure and regulatory stuff. Like it runs the gamut. And so for a couple of years, 2015 to 2017, I was running what I'm pretty sure was the first ever networking group in the world dedicated to carbon removal. And that was here in Seattle, where I am. And out of that I learned a lot about how the legacy carbon offsets market worked, or rather doesn't work very well, and saw a lot of low-hanging fruit for that, but also wanting to create a new business model that would spur carbon removal investment. And so that's what became Nori. So I founded Nori with several co-founders in 2017, and it was a marketplace for the idea was just to connect suppliers of carbon removals with buyers who wanted to pay for that. And that's sort of obvious at a high level, but more specifically, I really wanted to create the infrastructure that would make that transaction possible. So that means figuring out what is the appropriate price of that carbon. Eventually, we had to incorporate the concept of like, how permanent is that, or what is the source of that carbon? Although at the time, in 2017, like a lot of people forget this or weren't aware of it, but like back then, there's like kind of an obsession today at the corporate buying level with more permanent and durable stored carbon removal. But back then it was the opposite. It was the consensus opinion of people in the space was we should be focusing on nature-based removal, because why would we spend all this extra time and energy, literal energy, on technological carbon removal when we have these fantastic natural solutions available to us that have all these other amazing co-benefits as well. And they are scalable today, which I think is a very important point. We ended up raising venture money for Nori, so went down that path. And we raised several rounds. We ended up totaling, I think, about $20 million. In 2023, I realized that I was just tired of fundraising all the time. And because it turns out that that's what the job of a CEO is you are actually just a fundraiser. And so we hired a new CEO a guy named Matt Trudeau who came from Wall Street and markets background. He had built and launched a lot of different market exchanges before. And so I shifted roles and then eventually left full time. And then unfortunately, we had to wind down at the end of last year. Now, we had been focusing on regenerative agriculture credits and a partnership that we had with Bayer, which I could talk about that if you want to. I don't know. I don't know how useful it'll be, but we more or less ran into a situation where we ran out of cash before we could really prove our traction on the sales side, and weren't able to raise new funding, and unfortunately had to wind it down. So since then, I have been trying to help apply a lot of the lessons that I've learned from being involved in this industry for 10 years. And most recently, trying to help wake people up to the fact that like the current state of the industry and the current state of growth in the industry is nowhere near enough to match the scope of the challenge. And we're running out of time, and we need to start thinking about redesigning how our carbon removal industry works.
Sure. Cheers. Yeah, look, and I'm no doubt a huge amount of lessons over that 10-year journey that you're able to kind of give back with the stuff you do now. I wanted to lean on, I was listening during research, I was listening to some old conversations. I mean, a couple of years ago, which is not long ago, but in this sector, it does feel a long time ago. I'm going to paraphrase. You used a term, something along the lines of, we're letting perfect be the enemy of good. I think it was in the context of talking about, the kind of the net zero view and with where you're at now, and you've now talked about, I suppose, the transition to a net negative world being inevitable and obvious, which is so, talking about that statement and that reflection on what you were saying a couple of years ago, where do you see the place we're at now in this sector and that journey towards, net zero, or that journey essentially to trying to hit these goals, whether that's a net zero goal from a company point of view or whether it's the bigger picture. So.
Sure. Well, inevitable and obvious, that's the name of my Substack. And I called it that because I only want to work on things that are both inevitable, meaning someone's going to do it, so might as well be me, and obvious, meaning like there's a problem that's well defined, and then the solution seems obvious. So going back to carbon removal, it was like, well, obviously of course we're going to have to pull carbon out of the air. And here's how I think that we should try to do this. The current state of the industry is that you basically have like hundreds, estimated or counted up as over 500 carbon removal startups now, working on various different pathways for carbon removal. And just as Nori was, I am also totally agnostic to the method of removal. We need them all. We need them all operating at maximum possible scale. So there's no need to pick and choose winners here. There are hundreds of startups, and they are all removing carbon or planning to remove carbon, and they are all competing to sell their carbon to basically like 2 or 3 buyers. And that is a huge, huge issue. When Microsoft is currently responsible for purchasing over 60% of all carbon removal offtakes, like, that's not a market. That's a monopsony. It's the other side of a monopoly. So like a monopoly is you only have one provider of a service, and so they can kind of control the market, raise prices and stuff. In a monopsony, you have only one buyer, and so that means that the preferences and the decisions around like what they buy impact the entire market. And so the soapbox that I've been on lately is saying, look, this is not the only way that we can finance and pay for carbon removal. And also, I want to be like clear too. Microsoft are awesome. Like we wouldn't be here if not for them and Stripe and Shopify and these other big tech companies have made huge financial commitments. Like they are responsible for enabling the growth of the industry, which then brings in venture capital and then more startups and so on. So all those are good things. What I've been trying to argue is that that's been sort of like a phase 1 buildup. of the carbon removal industry. And I think we're at an inflection point where we need to be thinking about like a different approach for the next phase 2 of carbon removal, which needs to be much more about growth and scaling. And that's going to require thinking about how we answer the question of who pays for this in a very different way than we've been thinking about it up until now.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, absolutely, this challenge with, and I agree with your sentiment completely, Microsoft, it's incredible what they're doing. It's very important. It's also a massive problem, or it highlights a massive problem with the fact they make up such a big proportion of this voluntary market. Do you, and this is a huge question, but how do you see ways of solving that? I mean, this came up, I was at Unbound West Coast last year. This conversation came up. I forget who it was. It was another buyer it's another large company that's a buyer, but they were stating the fact that they articulated the percentage that they are compared to Microsoft as a buyer, and that this buyer as a corporate, we need hundreds more of them. And, they stated, I think, and I'm trying to remember, it was, there's more information needed around the market, more understanding, more, we seem to have a lot of companies cropping up to do things like more MRV, more, due diligence, more kind of rubber sealing of projects, but it actually doesn't make it any easier for your sustainability director coming in and wanting to invest in the voluntary market. Actually makes it more difficult.
So it's worse. Yes.
It makes it worse. Sorry, I'm not meaning to answer the question as I ask it, but what do you see as some of the solutions to widen this market to, the kind of next layer, I suppose, of organizations that we need investing?
Well, let's look at the problem and try to understand like why it is the way that it is, and then what the responses people have been taking to it, and why that doesn't seem like that's making it better. So the problem is, if you are a buyer of carbon removal at like the corporate level, and for the most part, this is tech companies. If you do an analysis of like the industries that have like free cash flow versus their footprints, the ability to pay is unfortunately the worst in the case of the companies that are creating the most emissions. And in the case of technology companies, which have, relatively speaking, not very large scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, they're the ones who have the most free cash that they're able to put into this. And so carbon removal has been a fringe thing. And if you are a CSO, your Chief Sustainability Officer, your number one concern, and I've heard this over and over and over again, is you are concerned about your reputational liability if you buy the wrong project. Nobody wants to be the next feature article from The Guardian who's talking about how what you bought wasn't real. And they certainly don't want to be facing fines or lawsuits from government regulators like it's happened in the EU because of some sort of failed diligence. And so what they do to respond to that is they have to look at like what are their options out there. And if you are, especially considering that a lot of the like negative press coverage has been around like, REDD+ projects and carbon avoidance projects, mainly from forestry and stuff like that, which I'm, personally not a huge fan of, but whatever. You look at that, and it's another way of thinking about it is like nature-based carbon removal is much easier to scale today, but it is much more difficult to measure. And then you have technological carbon removal or more engineered stuff. And it is, in many cases, easier to measure, but much more difficult to scale and more expensive. And so if you are a CSO, you're looking at it like, I need to reduce the risk. If I'm going to invest in carbon removal, I need to reduce the risk here. And so I start looking for different signals that I can utilize to help me be more confident that this is not going to blow up in my face. So you look for, have you been approved by ICRA or ICBCM, or do you follow the Oxford principles, or is the methodology or protocol rated by Silvera or B0, and which registry is this coming out of? And so you look for all of these reputational things. And it's like, none of these organizations have like a divine right to be the sole source of truth about this. This is just how we build trust in a confusing industry when we're dealing with an invisible and intangible product. And so everything that they've done makes perfect sense. If I were them, I would be doing the same thing. I would want to know that with as much certainty as possible, that what I'm paying for is having an impact and is real and is not going to blow up in my face. But what that means necessarily in practice then is not good for the planet or for the industry, because it means that they're only interested in buying the most expensive carbon removal that is the most measurable, that is the most precise, that is the most permanent, and in a lot of cases the most additional or they like to use this phrase of like their purchasing being catalytic, which is fine and good, but that's not going to get us to 10 billion tons of removal per year by 2050. And we have to start addressing that problem. So that's why we're in the situation that we are today. And it makes perfect sense and is totally valid. I don't think that anyone is doing anything wrong per se. And it also makes sense that in a situation where you're hearing feedback from sustainability departments that we want to be more sure, then of course people see opportunities for new companies to help with diligence and ratings and all of that kind of thing. But as we both agreed on earlier, like if you are a sustainability director and you're looking at, okay, there are a plethora of different ratings agencies and so on, which one do I go with? Like you almost get more confused the more that people try to do this. So that's the this like Gordian knot that we've tied for ourselves as an industry.
Yeah, it's not an easy problem to solve. I mean, naturally, as a young industry, there are. I mean, what did you say? 500 climate startups, I think you just said, which I didn't know. I didn't know that number, but that is a good reflection of the point there that there has to be a fair bit of amalgamation over time, and things need to simplify. I wanted to touch on something you said at the beginning, and just dig into the various technologies. I agree with your statement that we need all of these different technologies, to kind of deliver the goal, to reach the objective. I think something we have found, we're in the biochar space. I live in the north of Thailand, been here many years. So we're big advocates of, solutions that are people-based. We're working with farmers. We've gone through the MRV challenge, which continues and is part of a stumbling block. But, I'm personally highly skeptical of just how much investment's gone into things like DAC over the last kind of 2-3 years. And, you see the CDR report will report on sales rather than deliveries nearly all the time. It's like these big posts. Yeah. So I'm interested to hear where your head's at. I think when I was listening to some old stuff, and obviously knowing your history, I think you would be a huge advocate of nature-based solutions. Do you feel like the pendulum shifted? Obviously, biochar has been predominant in the news now for a year, I would say even. But are we doing enough? And what are the problems? I mean, there's a fair bit to unwrap there. But talking the high tech versus the other solutions.
Well, it's interesting because in terms of delivered carbon purchases, like if you're tracking on CDR.FYI, like delivered purchases is almost entirely biochar.
Yeah, so 95% or something. Yeah,
right. And there are reasons for that too, right? Because it is in terms of providing a removal method that is durable and very measurable, like biochar fits extremely well with that, and it's also much more affordable than like direct air capture, depending on the circumstances. So that makes sense to me why that is the method with the most deliveries. But there are a couple other things that I've been writing about these scaling barriers. So I sort of have identified them as kind of three main barriers. Like the first is around measurement precision, which is a lot of like if you're a layperson or which I don't mean that in a negative sense, but if you aren't a scientist and you are looking at these methods and you have two different potential methods to purchase from, and one is directly measured, and set aside some complications about that for a second. And the other is modeled. I think you are, from a risk management perspective, you are going to think that the one that is directly measured is safer to go with. And so that's what we see happening in purchases that people are making, whether that is through DAC or biochar or something like that, where it is very measurable. But again, that is not necessarily the same thing as most scalable. And from a
Yep.
planetary perspective, what we need is the most scalable. The other complicating factor is oftentimes it can be the case where what you think is a measurement is actually still just a measurement, but with error bars on it, and there's an uncertainty rating to it. And so like we saw this, and this came up so many times with Nori, where we had built our own methodology, partnering with the folks at Soil Metric and using the Dayscent model in the US. And then when we shut down, we were working on a new methodology with Perennial. And specifically to respond to this, where we had buyers, like there's a very well-known buyer out there who we spoke to, who has bought and does buy nature-based removals, and they said, we would be happy to consider purchasing from you, but you don't do soil sample testing as part of your methodology, and so therefore we can't be a buyer. Whereas, from the science perspective, we would respond and say, well, look, that getting soil sample testing doesn't actually necessarily mean what you think it means, and does not give you the certainty that you think it does. And in fact, we take our approach and then we just apply an uncertainty rating to it, and we discount the number. So if this is not exactly how it works, but a simplified way of describing this is if the numbers came back from the modeling and said you removed 100 tons, we might discount that by 40% and then only issue 60 credits or something like that. Because it's on us as the ultimate provider of that. And we had an insurance policy and so on. So anyway, that issue comes up a lot, and it's going to continue to come up, especially when we talk about like marine and ocean-based methods of removal. Like we're going to have to be doing estimations. Yep. And if we are only going to be buying the stuff that can be directly measured, then we are cutting off a number of different, especially nature-based methods that are very scalable and are extremely necessary.
For sure. Just on the tech side of things, you come from a tech background originally, right? I think you came from a software background. Interestingly, we talked about Microsoft before. I mean, the AI phenomenon that we are in now is actually causing a huge problem in terms of consumption and the way they're going to approach that. But also, are you seeing any really interesting kind of application of AI in the sector itself? It's not something I've really seen in terms of startups, and I've seen some modeling around climate models and stuff, but...
That is a great question. I was reading this article yesterday. I could send you this afterwards. By this guy, I can't even remember his name, but he writes about platforms, and he was writing this article about how whenever it comes to like gold rushes, we always use the analogy of like selling picks and shovels is where the real money is made. And he was making the argument that with the AI, that's not really the case. It's not. The picks and shovels are the apps that are like helping you just do the thing that you're trying to do, but do it better or faster or cheaper. The real value is going to come from using AI to discover new things that we don't actually already know. Or know to pursue. And so it's not picks and shovels, it's treasure maps. And I definitely think that is going to be applicable for any of these carbon removal spaces. I use these AI tools heavily in my work, in my writing, and much more on a like creative in a creative way. So I think that's a pretty important application, but I am sure I'm kind of blanking on some different applications, but especially when it comes to like measurement and monitoring, like AI is of course, obviously going to be doing, think of like Pachama. They've been doing machine learning on satellite imagery of forests for many years now. There are going to be many more like that.
Yeah, do send me that article. Actually, as I was asking that question, what prompted it. Actually, I was reading one of your other articles around just innovation and ideas of how we move this market forward, and there were some really fascinating, interesting ideas. One of them, and correct me if I'm wrong, was around a streaming service where, as you watch content, the user is able to remove carbon through their time watching content. Is that right? You had some really interesting, innovative ideas. Talk to us about some of those, because I think fascinating.
Yeah, so I mean that was actually what inspired Nori in the first place, or how I the model that I built for Nori was to enable that, because I never envisioned wanting to build a company that was just trying to sell carbon offsets to
Mm.
Fortune 500 companies, because like the math is, and I knew this 10 years ago too. Even if you add up the scope 1 and 2 emissions for all Fortune 500 companies,
Yeah.
set aside scope 3 because that's complicated, and I don't think it. As an aside, I hate the notion of scope 3 because everyone's scope 3 is someone else's scope 1 or 2.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
but if you just add up scope 1 and 2 for all Fortune 500, it's about 2 billion tons. That's not enough. So even if we had every single Fortune 500 company putting the required minimum budget into removing and accounting for all of their carbon emissions, we are still only 20% of the way there to the amount of carbon that we need to be removing annually by 2050.
Yeah.
And another way of thinking about that number is, and that number, 10 billion tons by 2050, that comes from a number of different places. Like IPCC has talked about 6 billion tons by then. The Rocky Mountain Institute and the Bezos Earth Fund put out a report a couple months ago that was advocating for 10 billion tons by 2050. And they were making the point of, like, if you follow an industrial S curve, meaning like we're going to slowly scale up and then we start accelerating the rate, that puts us working backwards. That puts us at 285 million tons per year by 2030. Which is only 5 years from now. And we are currently doing less than 1 million tons per year today. So huge scale up factors here. And I think I lost my train of thought on that. I remember another way of looking at that number is like the area under the curve. Cumulatively, from today until 2050, we need to remove 100 billion tons.
Wow. Okay.
What we are doing today is not enough. And so so coming back to your question, we have to find other ways of embedding carbon removal payments throughout the economy. Like, if we think of it like a garbage problem, which is an analogy that many people have made for a long time, like, if I walk into a store or a restaurant or something and I produce some sort of waste and I throw it in a trash can inside there, I'm not getting charged like an extra line item for my garbage removal. It's just like part of their cost of doing business. It's part of their overhead, and they've got like a municipal collection system for that and so on. Like, we don't have that kind of thing for carbon removal, and we need to build an equivalent of it that is global and economy wide. And so that article I wrote was trying to help seed some ideas. Like, I don't even know if any of those are good businesses. And there was a comment someone left that was like, okay, so you just came up with a bunch of like normal business ideas and took a little bit of the profit, used it to pay for carbon removal. Like, how is this thought leadership? Well, my point is that people are not currently doing these things, and we need to. And so the more that we can make it real, the more that we can help you envision it. Like, maybe you mentioned the streaming service one. Maybe there are two different ways that could go. One is you're a founder, or someone's a founder, and they want to go start a streaming company that incorporates this from the get-go as part of the branding and part of the marketing message, and they're appealing to people that way. Or maybe you are a product manager at Twitch and you read that and you think, maybe there's a way that I can talk with the folks on my sustainability team, and we can think about like how we might do a campaign like this that actually generates more users. And so like this could actually be a revenue generating type of exercise, rather than just looking at it like it's a cost center, which is what it currently is as a sustainability purchase. So that was what and the reaction that I've gotten to putting that article out there is lots of people saying the same thing that you did, of like, okay, these are really interesting ideas. So we need more of that. And I really want to put that out there so that more people are getting more creative.
Yeah, I mean, that's how, when I read the article, I can't remember the other, there was a bunch of ideas in there, but I thought it was great. It was creative. It was thought provoking. And I think that's the whole point. And clearly, you're an entrepreneur and you kind of coming from that angle of, we just need to think outside the box. I mean, just with that in mind, and obviously you're sitting in the US, like, how do you see the kind of current challenge of like the US market? So contextually, for example, we're starting to see a lot of movement here in Southeast Asia in Singapore. There was a really good article someone sent me today from the Straits Times, which was really encouraging a lot of investment. I almost think it's kind of a reaction to some of the shifts in the US. How do you see that being on the ground there in terms of, is this just now a private sector challenge because governmentally, it's just not going to happen, or is it kind of state by state? You can still see support, and maybe things will shift. And
well, it's not good. And like I just saw something that I think there's a proposal now because Congress has authorized the spending, so it's sort of questionable. But trying to get rid of the DAC hub funding. That would be terrible to get rid of. So it's not good. And we can't expect that anything is going to be different for the next 4 years. Certainly, there will be efforts at the state level from various different states across the country to do that, and many of them are doing different things. I live in Washington. We have a cap and trade sort of program, which I actually personally think is a waste of time and money and doesn't actually move the needle. And it's maybe even worse because it distracts from actually doing really good emissions reduction or removal. Nonetheless, it does have to be a private endeavor from now on, and other countries do need to step up. I mean, I think Mark Carney in Canada was talking about wanting to, like, part of the Liberals' platform there was saying they want to make Canada a hub for carbon removal technology. So that's good, I guess. Although I sure wish that the wealthiest country in the world with the most resources were working on it at the federal level as well. But in the meantime, like that is a point I've been trying to make of like, well, that's just the reality on the ground. Like we have to deal with that. We have to live with it. And we still have way too much carbon in the air. And so we do have to figure out new ways of doing this that are driven by private capital or are driven through alternative systems outside the US.
Yeah.
We don't have a choice.
Yes, and essentially, look, it is a voluntary market. I mean, this is very anecdotal, but I'm on the commercial side of our business. I'm looking at sales and buyers, and I've not really seen any impact. And actually, I'm seeing a kind of encouraging backlash outside of that, as in, just the movement now in Southeast Asia, and certainly talking to people in London. So, maybe there is a silver lining, but at the same time, it would be great, to have the largest economy kind of behind it. So. What is your view, just broadly looking over the next decade? I mean, what are the big movements that need to happen? What are the hopes, the kind of predictions, I suppose, from your point of view?
Well, the thing I've been thinking about a lot lately has just been about like how do we get this to scale faster, but also acknowledging that. Like in that RMI report that I mentioned a few minutes ago, they talk about like the amount of carbon to move, like 10 billion tons per year. If you look at an equivalent for like growth in like the steel industry or the coal industry or corn or any large commodity like that, moving that much material has typically taken about 50 years to get to that scale. So we have to do it twice as fast as has ever been done. And we have to do it with this like brand new intangible thing that also has political implications and has no currently like direct financial benefit. And so it is like, I mean, you're talking about a nearly impossible task, but it has to happen. It's not optional. So what I've been thinking a lot about lately is like, we need to buy more time. And so that leads me to be thinking about global cooling efforts. That's going to be what my next set of articles are going to be about in the blog is, like we are like getting carbon removal off the ground was a huge Herculean effort. And we went from like basically nothing, like a handful of like you had Climeworks and Carbon Engineering and a few other DAC companies around, and of course, like regenerative agriculture has been discussed since the early 2000s, and biochar has been around a long time. But as an industry, we went from basically zero to tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in a very short period of time, which is good. But when it comes to comparing that with global cooling efforts, and I'm talking about things like stratospheric aerosol injection or marine cloud brightening or albedo increasing efforts, things that can stabilize ice sheets, ways to protect coral reefs, and these climate change like adaptation methods. Like, we're not ready to do any of those, and they are 1,000-fold more complex than carbon removal, because like in the early days of Nori, and like we started with a podcast, and because we knew that we had to educate people, and one of the things that we were really trying to hammer on very early was carbon removal is not geoengineering, which is this like boogeyman word that scares a lot of people. Right? Yeah, it's justified why that's scary to people. But carbon removal is like something different. It's like there's not really much risk to it. Like, you say, yeah, sure, like you're not going to have like geopolitical tension caused over large scale carbon removal. Like, it's just a good thing to do. But if you're talking about stratospheric aerosol injection, and you might be changing like weather patterns and rain patterns, which means agriculture outputs might change. Like, countries go to war over such things. And then of course there's also with SAI, the bigger problem of like, it's really easy and cheap to do. And that's a good thing technologically speaking, but it's a bad thing when you consider like, we don't know what the unintended consequences will be, and you could get rogue actors, and it could be weaponized in various ways. Like, that's scary. So the complexity of preparing for how we're going to do, like, we're going to have to do this. There's going back to calling carbon removal inevitable and obvious. Like, global cooling is also inevitable and obvious. So it's like 5 to 15 years from now, we're going to have to be seriously discussing deploying SAI. I just don't see how we avoid that in any way. We are not ready. We are not ready for that. And so that's what I've been thinking about. And like, what do we need to do to start preparing? Like, how do we set up monitoring? What sort of research needs to be exponentially increased funding for, and that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, I don't know anything about it, SAI, but super interesting. I'll look forward to reading the blog. But as you're talking about it, I'm like, what are the business models inside that? Because as we just alluded to, about, we need the private sector to want to jump on board. Then you've got to find a business model in there. Otherwise, there
is no model. Yeah, right, I will give you a preview of this is going to be like a 5-part series. That's a preview of, I think, number 3. Like, there is no business model. There is no way to commercialize that. I mean, there's a company called Make Sunsets today, which is selling cooling credits. And there are a couple companies that I can't remember their names, but who are trying to restore Arctic ice. Essentially by pumping seawater up in the winter and hoping it freezes and has more of an impact.
Yeah.
Cool, go ahead. Good luck selling cooling credits. But I mean, like, as we just talked about, it's hard enough to sell carbon credits. So I don't know how you're going to do that. I really think that's another big issue. It's not commercializable, at least not immediately. And fundamentally, the ultimate question that comes down to any of these problems is who pays.
Yeah.
Like, the thing with carbon removal today is like, we have so many different ways of doing this, and we are constrained only by energy, water, geographic siting, and ultimately finance. And all of the first 3 are very solvable. The last one, though, is a much harder question. And when you start trying to apply that to global cooling efforts, it becomes even more complicated to figure that out.
Yeah, this is another subject, but this is kind of what I've seen emerging in the biodiversity space somewhat over the last year, which has been really fascinating and for us quite exciting because we kind of fit into that area. However, when you start talking about a biodiversity credit, and then you're like, well, what is the business driver for a company investing other than wanting to make the world better? Whereas at least with removal, we do have this kind of, hey, I'm trying to hit this goal, therefore I must do this. There is at least some modeling. So
think of it. Let me get a term for this. There's the late James C. Scott, a political philosopher who wrote like his most well-known book is Seeing Like a State. And in it, he talks about this concept that he calls legibility, which is like, if you go to a city like London or Boston with like, very curvy, confusing streets that were originally like horse paths and stuff like that, and people just built where they were. That's like spontaneous order developing from things naturally happening over time. If you go to a city like Paris, it with its like very specific arrondissements and the wide boulevards, like they built it that way to make it harder to build barricades because there were so many revolutionary events and so on, right? And so you get these like very clear things. Like if you are a nation state, like we all have, like in the US, we have social security numbers. Like you have like a national like ID number and stuff like that, because you need to identify people. You need to be able to know like how to collect taxes from them. You have to have, it's just like good data principles. If you are a sustainability director, like a carbon removal credit is less legible than a carbon reduction effort, which is less legible than like a waste reduction effort. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got carbon removal, you've got like carbon credits, and then you start getting even less legible in terms of a biodiversity credit. What does biodiversity mean? How do you value that? How do you quantify that? So I don't think, I mean, my intuition is that that's not going to be a winning strategy long term. Yeah. And while the goals are good, I think that we need to pursue other potential ways of paying for that and making it happen.
Yeah, I agree, completely agree. And I actually think, I mean, insetting is something I don't think we've seen enough of, but also I think just organizations partnering and co-developing projects, I think answers part of that problem. Certainly if I was a sustainability director, manager inside a company, and do I want to buy credit, or do I want to be intricately involved in a project and then report on the outcomes as part of our strategy? I mean, I think there needs more of that. So, hey, look, we're coming towards the end of our time. Maybe I'll end with a question that's a good starting question, which was, what was your kind of light bulb moment, or was there one? I mean, you used to be in software. You're an entrepreneur. I mean, was there a point where you woke up one day and went, hey, I want to fix the environment? Was it that simple? Or
Yeah. So I had been working in consulting, doing software stuff, and I was tired of that, and a few things came together all at once. One was I worked at this really awesome company that was called Ubermind, and we built mobile apps for big companies, and then we got bought by Deloitte Consulting, and so this huge monolith comes in, and they kind of disrupted all of the good culture that we had built up, and I really missed that. I really wanted to work somewhere where we had that kind of energy to the company culture, and so that made me want to go build that myself, because I couldn't find that anywhere. And I had done a couple like smaller businesses that didn't really do anything or go anywhere. And someone suggested to me that I watch Simon Sinek give his Starts With Why.
Yeah. Great talk.
Yeah. And so as I was thinking about that, my conclusion, my takeaway from it was that I was going to make a bet that in 2015, I really miss working with an awesome, talented team of people. I bet more people are going to care about working on climate change in the future. And so I will go work on that. The other, I was considering like AI or climate. And I also didn't really have as much of a clear path on what I would contribute to in AI. So I started focusing on climate, and then I started thinking about like, how do we just like make this happen? How do we flip the incentive structure so that right now we are all incentivized to freely emit carbon? How do we change the incentives so that you are incentivized to remove carbon? And that way we can actually build a like scalable system that works from the bottom up. And that was what put me on the carbon removal journey.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that. And look, appreciate you jumping on the podcast. It's been interesting, and best of luck, I think, with the next kind of journey, because you sounds like you're just at the beginning of that, or it's certainly not, certainly in the first year of this new journey. Where do people find out more about yourself, the work you're now doing, get in touch if they want to? And I will share all of these notes in the speaker notes for anyone watching or listening.
Yeah, well, now what I'm doing is I'm doing a consulting advisory practice, like I want to help both buyers and suppliers of carbon removal incorporate like new business model innovations for carbon removal into what they're doing. So like, I gave that example of like, if you are a product manager, if you're a sustainability person at Twitch and you want to talk to me, you want to talk about like, how do we incorporate that, incorporate carbon removal into more of what we're doing, then I would love to help with that. And if you are a carbon removal supplier and you are tired of just trying to sell to the same handful of corporate sustainability teams, then like, let's talk about like trying to come up with different business models that can help pay for that. So people can find all about me at carbonremoval.com, where I've got my newsletter linked there, so they can sign up for that. It's inevitable and obvious. That's on Substack. And then my advisory services and describing what I do is all there. Carbonremoval.com.
Cool. Carbonremoval.com. So yeah, and for anyone watching or listening, I'll also put that in the notes. So yeah, Paul, thanks for jumping on. Appreciate it. Good to chat. I'm sure we'll probably talk again, and yeah, enjoy your evening.
Yeah, thanks very much, Matt.